never had much of a family. Mom died with her folks having cut her off. Dad was in and out of psychiatric hospitals before he took his own life. The only living relative I was aware of was my paternal uncle. But one of the few dark secrets concerning my family that I actually knew was that my uncle blamed himself for my dad's death. As a result, he built himself a log cabin up in Maine and had been living in seclusion ever since I only had a rough idea of where the cabin was, and even less of a desire to reach out to him. He was just as dead to me as my parents were. Because the truth is, I blamed him for my dad's death to having someone to direct my anger towards someone to blame. It was the only thing that allowed me a measure of peace after a terrible, miserable childhood. Against all odds, by the summer of 2015, I actually built something of a life for myself out here in Boston area. I was an assistant manager of a brewery pub. I had a small, but nice apartment. I even got a couple of dates here and there. I was firmly in the process of putting my old life behind me, and that felt better than I can possibly describe. Then came the letter that changed everything. It was from an attorney's office in Augusta, Maine. And as soon as I saw which state it was postmarked from, I had an inkling of the news that followed. Lo and behold, it was a letter stating that my uncle had died. And that this guy had been tasked with dividing my uncle's estate among his surviving relations. I'd always assumed he didn't have much money. And I was read about that. But that didn't mean I hadn't been allocated something in his last will and testament. Yet, irritatingly enough, I'd have to go all the way to Augusta to find out what it was. Give the attorney's office a call line about being too busy to make the drive and just ask them straight up what had been left in the will. So imagine my curiosity when this guy tells me he has no idea what it is, that all he has is a key to a security deposit box located in an Augusta bank. He has been paid to ensure I open the box and understand the significance of the contents. Nothing more, is only motivation being that his payment is locked inside the box. It sounded like the plot of a bad movie. And only once the attorney had assured me that he was deadly serious to actually start to believe it. Part of me wanted nothing to do with it, and told me it'd be nothing but picking at old wounds, dragging up a past I'd worked so hard to leave behind. But peace of mind doesn't pay the bills. And as greedy as it sounds, if there was money to be had, I wanted a piece of it. So I took a half day one Friday, and mid-July the 17th or the 19th, I think it was, began the 5.5-hour round trip to Augusta up in Maine. It's a pretty nice drive in the summertime, and the view's quiet, and the growing feelings of dread for as long as they were able to. But as I pulled up outside the quaint home, the offices of the law firm Stevens & Day, I felt like I was on the verge of a miniature panic attack. I'd gotten into my head somehow that all I was going to get was a letter telling me some awful truth about my family that had ruined all the progress had made over the past 4 or 5 years. So you can only imagine my trepidation as I meet with the attorney and drive over to Bangor Savings Bank to unlock the box with him. I was actually clammy with nerves by the time the bank manager ushered us into the room housing the deposit boxes. And when I cracked it open to reveal nothing but a wad of cash and a single letter, I thought my worst fears were confirmed. The attorney took the money. But when it came to me opening the letter, I was obviously hesitant. It reached the point where the guy asked me if I was actually going to read it, or if I wanted some time alone. When I hit him with what I thought was a pretty unusual request. I wanted him to read the letter for me, then summarize it as clinically and coldly as possible. I knew I wouldn't be able to bring myself to read it for a long, long time yet. At the same time, I had to know what it said. He was blood, and as much as I hated him, I knew that honoring his final message was at a minimum the right thing to do. And watched the attorney's face the whole time as he unsealed the envelope, took out the letter and began reading. He briefly scanned the contents before a look of puzzlement came over his face. And sensing my impatience, he just showed me what was written. If there wasn't some long-winded apology or explanation, it wasn't a goodbye or a dying request. All what was written were a set of numbers that I figured were coordinates, and 3 scrawled words. Burn it all. When the attorney asked me what the significance of the coordinates were, and didn't have an answer for him, but all it took was a quick Google search to work out, then they pointed to a seemingly random spot in the Dead Scanning Lakes wilderness area, wasn't certain what I was 90% sure that this was the location of his cabin. But whatever he wanted me to burn was a complete mystery to me. In the space of about 10 minutes, I went from wanting nothing more to do with such a grim situation, to being consumed with morbid curiosity. My imagination went into overdrive, and I theorized on all the dangerously illegal or disgustingly immoral things he might have been up to out there. I just had to know more. Because if he'd left some terrible, shameful legacy behind, you could bet I wanted to destroy it. The ride back to the Stevenson day gave me an opportunity to politely grill the attorney on my uncle's death. I figured if he'd fallen ill or died at home, then someone must have seen the inside of his cabin. But according to the attorney, my uncle had driven himself to the hospital about a week before he died, and had made the deposit box arrangement with him months before. So for all intents and purposes, the only person that had ever seen the inside of that log cabin was my uncle. Before I left the guy's office, I asked him his advice, and I'll never forget what he said. Well, as my grandpa used to say, sometimes things bury you if you don't bury them first. And he was right. I couldn't lose any more sleep over this nonsense. It almost killed me once before, and there was no way I was going to let that happen again. It was clear what needed to be done. I drive out to that cabin, do my uncle one last favor, and burn whatever horrible truth that contained ashes. I planned to check into a nearby hotel, then set at first light the next morning after 8 hours of sleep. But 8 hours sleep turned to be rather ambitious. When the clock on the motel wall ticked over to 2 a.m., I figured a better use of my time would be to scour Google Maps for the best route out to the cabin. Then by the time the first slivers of blue dawn began to creep onto the horizon, I was packed up and ready to go. I didn't figured I'd need much, just a jerrycan of gas and a box of matches. And those were easily procured. Then once I had one of those extra large gas station coffees and my drinks holster, I was just about ready for the 3-hour drive out to the lakes. The entire drive, I had those 3 words just echoing around my skull. Burn it all. I've never been so fully consumed with curiosity in all my life. It was an ache like that feeling when you hold your breath for too long and just need to let it all out. I had to know how my uncle had been living for the past 30 years. And what it was he wanted me to burn. But to explore that cabin would be to risk my sanity. When I could just burn the thing to the ground and walk away and go on living. I tried so hard to make up my mind. But the truth is, I didn't know what I was going to do until I was face to face with the old Retton cabin, face to face with the truth. When I was almost certain that I was within walking distance of Letter's coordinates, I parked my car up in an old lot near a trailhead, then headed northwest towards what I assumed was going to be the cabin. But about a half hour or so into my hike, I began to notice something rather unusual about the area's flora. And it wasn't long before one particular sight stopped me dead in my tracks. There, mining in the dirt in front of me, was what looked like a mix between a pile of beef mince and a brain. At first glance, I really did think it was living, or at least once living flesh, the shade and texture that was almost identical to meat, but I soon realized that what I was looking at was actually a kind of fungus. I later discovered it to be given Mitra esculenta, or more commonly, brain fungus. And although it can be highly poisonous, it's not an uncommon sight in northeastern forests. However, what was uncommon was the frequency with which I sighted the distinct-looking fungus around the woods. And those weren't the only weird mushrooms I found out there. And the next variety I saw was even fewer than the last. While the brain fungus was just kind of gross-looking, I mistook the devil's tooth mushrooms for chunks of bloody human tissue. Go ahead and look those up. By the way, you'll see what I mean. Younger specimens basically bleed this bright red substance that I later discovered contains anticoagulant properties. In plain English, it looks like blood, and it can make you bleed easier. Creepy, right? But again, not nearly as creepy as just how many of the disgusting little things were dotted around the forest. They were everywhere, sometimes 2 or 3 around the base of every tree. And the closer I got to the coordinates, the more there seemed to be. I had this GPS app on my phone that was helping me keep track of where I was. And I didn't have to worry about the cell service cutting out because it worked offline too. But as it turned out, I didn't need any fancy equipment to find my way to the cabin. All I had to do was follow the mushrooms. I smelled the cabin before I saw it. It was this pungent, almost stewed meat smell, but with a sickly rotten taint to it, and by the time actually dies on the filthy wooden paneling through the trees. I almost had to cover my mouth and nose in order to push forward. The thing was covered in those brain fungus and devil-tooth mushrooms. Nestled in where the wood met the soil or where moisture and dank was able to cling under windowsills. I can't stress how utterly exhausted I was by this point either. It was almost noon, one of those cloudy summer days that just seals all the humidity and like a lid on a jar. And I'd been hiking with about 2 gallons of gasoline in my backpack, which let me tell you was no easy feat. I just want to get things over with so I could set off back to my car. But a thought struck me as I was pulling a gas can from my backpack. I had no idea what the smell was. It was due to some kind of flammable gas. Maybe that's what my uncle meant when he told me to burn it all. Maybe it was primed to ignite and all I needed to do was toss a match on it. But if it was indeed flammable, the intensity of the fumes meant I'd risk blowing myself up if I just tossed on an open flame from arm's length. So that raises the question of just what was making that god-awful stench. But finding out, man, looking into the cabin, something I promised myself I wouldn't do. But what harm could one little peek till the journey out here had been depressing and confusing enough? Seeing how some miserable old hermit lives his life couldn't be so bad, could it? Of course not. So why was I so terrified to open that front door? Well, as it turns out, it's because I just couldn't compute what I'd see on the other side. The inside of the cabin was just as infested with fungus as the outside. And it was so humid in there that it felt like a freaking sauna. The first thing I saw as I attempted to cover my mouth and nose with the neck of my t-shirt was a huge pot on the stove. My uncle had been dead for about a week by this point. But before he died, he'd filled that pot with enough of whatever it was that it was only just beginning to boil down as it slowly simmered away. The opening to the pond was stuffed with rubber piping, arterial little tubes that seemed to run all over the cabin, each pumping out a kind of vapor that simply must have been the source of the stench. The place looked like a cross between a drunk factory and some mad scientist lab. That was sad, and moldy books lying on the floor. A blackboard with some indecipherable pictograms on it. And that was just about all I could get a glimpse of before my eyes started to water and I was eventually forced to retreat from the open door, where I promptly vomited those fumes. They were just unbearable. Like my head was spinning and I honestly thought that I might pass out for a moment. I have no idea what he was doing in there. All I know is that it had something to do with all those mushrooms. There were so many of them there that I thought I could almost hear them moving or something. It was this repulsive intestinal hum that made my skin crawl to listen till after I collected myself I wrapped my shirt around my face to create a kind of makeshift respirator, then set about emptying the contents of the gas can all over the outer wall of the cabin. Then, with a flick of a match, it all went up in flames. And I know it was just my ears playing tricks on me. That what I heard was just the sound of moisture escaping the soaked wood. But I'd have sworn I heard the screams of that fungus has burned when I finally drove back home. I was no more enlightened than I had been before. If anything, I only had more unanswerable questions. More to keep me up at night when that not knowing anxiety gets too much to bear. But still, I'm glad I burned that cabin down, that didn't leave whatever darkness contained to be stumbled on by somebody else. I thought I might hear about it in the news too. And for a day or two, I wondered if I'd accidentally started some kind of forest fire. But no news ever came. Not even so much as a peep. And I figured that maybe it wasn't just my uncle who wanted whatever was up there to stay secret, that it all runs deeper than I could possibly imagine. but I try not to think about it anymore. Like I said, I've made something of a life for myself, even got a long-term girlfriend who I've been talking about marriage and kids with, and I'll be darned if I do anything to mess that up. And if you're ever out near the depths, Conic Lakes, keep an eye out for those mushrooms. Because if you start seeing a little too many of them, it might be better for you if you went back the way you came. In June of 1976, the wealthy all-American Robinson family of Lathrop Village, Detroit are vacationing at their Lake Michigan cottage just north of Goodhart, near the Straits of McKenna. Husband and wife couple Dick and Shirley made their money through publishing and advertising. And I had raised 4 wonderful children together and their almost 20 years of marriage. There was 19-year-old Richard, 16-year-old Gary, 12-year-old Randall, and 7-year-old Susan. To all who knew them, the Robinsons were the model of a successful, happy modern family. But hidden just beneath the surface was a whole host of dark secrets, some of which were considerably more sinister than the others. Not only was Dick's new art magazine beginning to struggle, but his general financial situation was looking pretty dire. Company bills went unpaid. Bank accounts were subjected to some rather erratic activity, and investors were increasingly starting to doubt that Dick Robinson could make a return on their money. But on top of that, the secretary turnover at Dick's offices had reached double digits over the past decade, with employee after employee handing in their notice without having even completed the full year in their employment. This was down to the incontrovertibly creepy and lecherous atmosphere that Dick fostered in his workplace. And he was known for his bizarre habit of asking female staff members to lift their skirts so he could touch their bare thighs. As you can imagine, Dick's wife knew nothing of this. And as the family headed out to the summer home they called Somerset, a log and stone cottage set on a twisting road a half a mile west of Lakeshore Drive, she could have never expected the horror that was destined to unfold there. Around a month after the Robinsons first arrived at Somerset, the caretaker responsible with maintaining the vacation homes began to receive a number of complaints regarding a bad smell coming from the Somerset house, and the caretaker arrived at the property. He found all doors and windows to be locked or bolted, and assumed that the Robinsons had left out some food before they left, or that maybe a sewage pipe had burst inside. Knowing the Robinsons would want him to do everything he could to ensure the safety and integrity of their property, the caretaker forced his way into the home as cleanly and non-destructively as he could. But when he did so, he was greeted with a sight so terrible and violent that it haunted him for the rest of his life. One of the first things the janitor noticed when entering the house, aside from the overpowering stench of rot, was just how hot it was. The Michigan summer had been a relentless one, and even without central heating, the heat had been nearly unbearable. But here was the Somerset house in the third week of July, with its heat on full blast. He was then greeted with the sight of Shirley Robinson's corpse. The heat having ramped up the decomposition process, with stomach-churning results. She was laying on her stomach with a plaid blanket covering her lifeless body from the knees up, with clotted blood having crept out from a single shot to the head from a .25 caliber pistol. Her husband Dick was found dead lying atop a heating vent and had been shot with both the .25 caliber that killed his wife and what was later deemed to be a .22 caliber rifle. He had also suffered blunt force trauma to his skull, which had cracked wide open by giving the unsuspecting caretaker an unfettered view of its festering contents. The caretaker ran outside the home and immediately vomited, then rushed to call and local law enforcement. Police later found young Randall lying on top of his dead father. The 12-year-old had been executed with a single shot to the head. Much like his mother, the boy had been partially covered up with a blanket. The body of 7-year-old Susan Robinson was found just meters away from those her father and brother. She had several gunshot wounds, but also had an acute skull fracture that appeared to have been inflicted by some kind of hammer. The 2 oldest Robinsons were found in one of the bedrooms, having been shot several times in the head with a .25 caliber. 16-year-old Gary had been shot twice in the head, but had also apparently been shot in the back with a .22 rifle, as if he was fleeing from his assailants. The police ballistics analysis was later called in, whose job it was to paint a picture of just how the shooting had taken place based solely on the positions of the bodies and the path of the bullets. This ballistics expert determined that someone had approached the cabin from a distance, observing until they had a clear shot on Dick Robinson through one of the cottage windows. Then once the opening shots of the attack were fired, the killers closed in to finish the job. They approached the house, kicked in the back door, then chased the surviving family members through the house, shooting and killing them one by one. Once the killers had buried the Robinson family name, they drew the curtain so no one would be able to see the bloody scenes inside, ramped up the central heating, and actually covered up the broken window with a sheet of cardboard. The fact only a single set of bloody footprints were found at the scene of the crime indicated it was the work of a lone assassin. One who had covered up their tracks so well that not only did the murders go unnoticed for an entire month, but the state of decomposition meant it was difficult to determine exactly when the murders had taken place. It was evidence of a well-planned, well-executed attack by someone who knew what they were doing, possibly having even killed before. The last people to ever see the Robinson family alive were a pair of tree surgeons who had been employed by Dick, who trimmed the trees in the cabin's immediate vicinity. Neighbors also remembered hearing loud noises and raised voices around late June, but assumed the gunshots were from nearby hunters and failed to report them. Given Dick's sketchy financial situation, great emphasis was placed on the potential suspect being an aggrieved business partner or perhaps an unpaid customer. This is how police came to interview a man named Joseph Scalera, a 30-year-old ex-soldier who'd been working for the Robinson advertising agencies since the mid-60s. Investigators began to notice several glaring inconsistencies in his given statements. And further digging brought up evidence that Solero was actually embezzling large amounts of money from the company. Although seemingly unconnected to the murders, it was this tidbit of information that made Solero a person of interest, and he soon became the focus of many hours of police investigation. It was subsequently discovered that Joseph had recently paid a visit to a local firearms dealer, where he had purchased 2 automatic Beretta pistols and an Armalite AR-15. Police cross-checked the calibers of these weapons and made a chilling discovery. The pistol was a .25 caliber and the rifle a .22, exactly the same size bullets as those used to kill the Robinson family. Then, through the course of their investigation, it was discovered that Scalera's father-in-law was the owner of a local firing range. On a hunch, police launched a thorough search of the facility and found AR-7 cases identical to those found at the Somerset house. Although Scalera claimed to have given this weapon away, a neighbor had told police that he had seen the .22 caliber AR-7 rifle in Scalera's house not long before the Robinsons were killed. During the interviews that followed this new suspicion, Scalera failed to lie detector tests, and a third test was judged to be inconclusive. It was also noted that he tried to deceive the polygraph interviews in his pre-test interviews, but an Emmett County prosecutor decided not to bring charges against him at that time, setting the to missing murder weapons in the absence of his fingerprints from the crime scene. However, 4 years later, in 1972, a newly elected chief prosecutor in Oakland County reopened the prosecution, believing he could secure a conviction against the case's prime suspect. But on March 8 of 1973, when Scalera learned of the impending charges and arrest, he took his own life for the same handgun that was believed to be the Robinsons' murder weapon. Joseph left behind a bloodstained typewriter note on which he had written, "I am a liar, a cheat, and a phony," along with a list of people that he had swindled and multiple business schemes. He then added a handwritten note to his mother on the same sheet of paper, saying, "I had nothing to do with the Robinsons. I'm a liar, but not a murderer. I'm sick and scared. God and everyone, please forgive me." Since Michigan law does not permit an open murder case to be officially closed, the taking of the life of the prime suspect Scalera placed the case in an inactive file. But as a result, many of the burning questions surrounding the Robinson murders will remain unanswered. Over the years, both amateur and professional investigators have come up with a variety of theories which attempt to explain the motive or name of a suspect. But to date, none have ever been substantiated. Those who personally knew Dick Robinson were quoted as saying that they had never known a better family man, friend, or business partner, and can't imagine why anyone would murder him or his family in such a horrendous, merciless act. What's more, plenty of doubt has been cast in the supposed guilt of Joe Scolaro. Thought to be nothing more than a small-time crook whose financial misdeeds got him caught up in a larger web of lies and murder. But regardless, the official stance in that murder of the Robinson family has never been found. And as years go by, the person responsible is less and less likely to be found. So it might well be possible that in the past, present, or future, a person will go to their grave having executed fleeing children, and completely gotten away with it.